Hello and welcome to CherrySTEM. I would like to direct your attention to the screen for those who are watching, of you who are watching, and those of you who are listening. You can check out patreon.com/AnnaCherry. It's got good things, including the public recordings and public posts of these shows that we do and all the references that we bring up. So if you'd like to learn more and support us along the way, check out patreon.com/AnnaCherry. Now, to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right.
And I did not change the title because there's always one thing. There's one thing that I miss every time. Sometimes it's sound, sometimes it's a title, sometimes it's something else. But, I think a better way to get our show started would be to let Donnie take it away for a minute.
Donnie, take it away.
Donnie, take it away.
Let's hear your wisdom.
Let's do it.
As you can see, the lifeline is divided into two polar extremes, fear and love. Fear is in the negative energy spectrum, and love is in the positive energy spectrum. Excuse me? No, duh is a product of fear. Now, on each card is a character dilemma which applies to the lifeline. Please take this. Thank you. Please read each character dilemma aloud and place an X on the lifeline in the appropriate place. Sharita?
Juanita has an important math test today. She's known about the test for several weeks, but has not studied. In order to keep from failing her class, Juanita decided that she will cheat on the math test.
Good, very good. Mr. Darko.
Ling Ling finds a wallet on the ground filled with money. She takes the wallet to the address on the driver's license but keeps the money inside the wallet. I'm sorry, Miss Farmer, I don't get this.
Just place an X on the lifeline in the appropriate place.
No, I mean, I know what to do. I don't get this. You can't just lump things into two categories. Things aren't that simple.
The lifeline is divided that way.
Well, life isn't that simple. I mean, who cares if Ling Ling returns the wallet and keeps the money? It has nothing to do with either fear or love.
Fear and love are the deepest of human emotions.
Okay, but you're not listening to me. There are other things that need to be taken into account here, like the whole spectrum of human emotion. You can't just lump everything into these two categories and then just deny everything else.
If you don't complete the assignment, you'll get a 0 for the day.
Donald, let me preface this by saying that your Iowa test scores are intimidating. So, let's go over this again. What exactly did you say to Ms. Farmer?
I'll tell you what he said. He asked me to forcibly insert the lifeline exercise card into my anus.
Okay.
Yeah. That happened.
So the wise young man, Donnie Darko, says that's too simple. Actually, there's some level of truth to that argument, but I generally want to say that that's also bullshit. I
think it's doubly bullshit because the whole idea, spoilers, of the movie Donnie Darko is that he is Jesus, the person that advocated love more than anyone in historical record.
Well, of course there are. Here's the thing.
So what?
It's like
what?
First off, the whole idea is that they're presenting it as people who simplify things into a binary perspective, and theoretically we're supposed to believe that they're oversimplifying it down to just two things and nothing else exists. That is not actually where the idea of love and fear comes from. It isn't supposed to be about a continuum, and it's supposed to be about base principles that lead to complexities up above that.
And I feel like they present that fairly well in this short video, because you see that it is a continuum, first of all, and secondly, she does say that everything fundamentally divides into two basic things.
Yeah. Okay, so there's going to be people that are like, well, it doesn't just divide into two things. There are all these other things. They're all different. They can't be. Well, okay. The
whole point of Donnie Darko is that he sacrifices himself to save humanity. He is Jesus.
Well, I don't care about that as much as, like, if you look at things from, like,
that's just a question from chat.
a perspective of like, I don't know, maybe thermodynamics or entropy. There are ways in which you can simplify things down to where at the basis of reality there are these kinds of, nearing binary continuums where it's not actually binary but there are things that are mutually dependent duals. Like, in other words, a river doesn't exist without both the water and the riverbed. There's two things,
right?
And both of them are dependent upon the other for their formation, and so picking one above the other. There's
like a brain doesn't exist without electrical impulses, or electrical impulses don't exist without a brain.
Complexities, of course, and simplifying things where you were to say there is nothing but love and fear, and that is all that exists. Okay, that would be ridiculous. So the thing is,
but that's not what they said.
He's saying that they're oversimplifying, but he's oversimplifying their perspective.
Exactly, because I feel like they do
and of course,
nuance.
that teacher probably has absolutely a binary perspective.
And the guy that they use to teach that idea is a pedophile.
Yeah. So they really try to make it seem very, very negative in the movie, and that's always annoyed me about that.
Same.
Movie.
That's why we played.
There's a lot of other things that annoy me about that movie, but that in particular annoys me about that movie.
Yeah. So we just had to. We couldn't help ourselves. Sorry.
We had to play it because we had to give some shit to Donnie Darko. As much as it was an enjoyable movie, it was also a very annoying movie.
I do recommend watching it, seeing what you gather from it. But the general consensus is that it is a parable of Jesus.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, they actually explain it.
Right.
That
is the canon of it.
Yeah, there's an explanation from the creators that there's all these little metaphors and quantum physics and
he's quantum Jesus. Yeah,
he's quantum Jesus. Exactly.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
And so there's a first year psychology student's perspective on reality present in Donnie Darko.
Yes.
That is entertaining. But that's about as far as it goes for me personally. So the idea of love versus fear. I mean, first off, he said the one that's like she picks up the wallet and doesn't give the money back. Is that love or fear? And he's like, well, this is ridiculous. Well, okay, is it? Truth of the matter is, fear has to do with survival instinct. It has to do with being able to survive. And so, at its base, when we look at it from a perspective of where does fear itself come from, and if we use the word fear as a symbol for
a set of behaviors,
all of those behaviors which were derived from the attempt to survive in a particular way, which is to draw back from things and to accumulate resource, then it is based upon fear that she is attempting to survive, which is why that she would choose. And so, of course, there's all these other things, present there. But to say that it is not dealing with fear is, ridiculous, because then at the other end of this perspective, of this same perspective, is the fact that love is this attempt at unity that has to do with self-sacrifice, and often in these complex systems, the action of love is less about the individual and more about the group. It's about group competition instead of individual competition, and this comes from a perspective of game theory. So it
was also really interesting because on one hand you can keep the money to survive yourself as an individual, but on the other hand, bringing back the wallet is a communal gesture which also helps you survive. So there's two different survival strategies just in that question.
And not just it's a survival strategy that if you happen to know the person, then you have enhanced trust. Enhancing trust leads to better cooperation, which means better group cohesion, which means the group itself can compete better.
By keeping the money and giving the wallet, that's right about the middle of the spectrum. You're kind of fearful because you're keeping the money, but you're also kind of wanting to at least bring back something to the community,
Right.
give person back their ID or whatever it is they lost.
Theoretically, he should have been
Pictures
able
of
to
their
put the mark somewhere in the middle, because it's supposed to be a continuum, because it's supposed to be.
But he thought he knew better.
But he's like, these teachers oversimplifying.
No, actually, that's you, buddy.
No, that's projection there, fam.
My dude.
My dude. So fear and love actually do act as opposites in the brain as well.
Yeah, and that's what the show's all about.
And that is that there is where specifically I like to use the representatives of fear and love as kappa opioid receptors and oxytocin activated neurons. In the way in which they are arranged in the amygdala, you actually find that when the way that kappa opioid neurons, what they synapse on is they synapse inhibitorily on those neurons which are activated by oxytocin. And oxytocin,
once again, kappa opioid is the fear and social learning receptor. It is activated when a person's frightened,
right, or ostracized, or
stressed socially.
Yeah, there's
or abused as a child.
There's some complexities there where different parts of where for instance there is a lot of the discussion around autism and the male versus female what's it called? Dimorphism of the amygdala is a very big difference between male and female brains, and the way in which those neurons are
men and women deal differently with fear and socialness.
Right, and so like the size of the neurons, the way that they are arranged to some extent, these things are different
the dominance of the
from
hemispheres?
male and female, and in general, whenever you're talking about oxytocin,
the amygdala, one side is bigger than the other.
Right. Yeah, the amygdala is one side is activated. And the way in which it activates in men and women is actually left-right dominant.
Right, yeah.
And so there's the different, and it's different from male to female in general. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and hopefully I don't have to go into all that. But
I just wanted to bring up that kappa opioid is specifically a fearful receptor, and it synapses, so it interacts and inhibits oxytocin, which is the bonding and trusting, loving.
Generally, what happens also, the way in which kappa opioids are related to fear is that generally you release kappa opioids at the same time as mu opioids, which are the
natural pain relief.
The natural pain relief. There is some level of pain relief with kappa opioids as well. It acts in a different way by blocking a pain instead of the way that mu opioids work, which has more to do with the reward part of the brain. But they are released simultaneously as part of a spectrum of endorphins. And so obviously, if you don't want, let's look at this from a systems design principle, that you do not want an animal, if you are designing it, to constantly be damaging itself to get the reward of the
mu opioids.
And why are those linked to reward? Well, that's a whole other discussion that would try to cite. But there are these complex feedback loops.
Reward is at the base of
and there's reasons for it to be there, but we won't get into that right now. Let's just look at the fact that you would want some system to set up learning to avoid the stimulus that caused the mu opioids to be released. So in other words, you have pain, and so it's not just pain that if you're trying to block off the pain, you still want some sort of memory, some sort of system that keeps you
from doing that again.
Keeps you from doing that again. Exactly. You have to remember, don't fucking do this. And part of that is
it's okay for now, but
it leads to an increase in kappa opioids, and so the kappa opioid receptors, specifically on the amygdala, the fear part of the brain, you end up finding that, for instance, soldiers that are suffering from PTSD, they have a higher amount of kappa opioid receptors in the amygdala. Children who've undergone abuse have a higher amount of kappa opioid receptors in the amygdala. So all these different things point to the idea that this is a system for avoidance. And then that system of avoidance also then, as those receptors are activated, they inhibitorily synapse on the oxytocin neurons. In other words, neurons that are activated by oxytocin. So what does that mean in terms of how that impacts emotion? Well, that means that, okay, oxytocin is very closely related to trust mechanisms. When you administer oxytocin to people,
and pair bonding.
There's pair bonding, and there's also even monetary sharing, etc. When people will actually share money,
People
more
are willing
often
to be more fair and
when
more
they're
sharing,
administered oxytocin in various psychological tests. So there is a bonding and trust component of oxytocin that it goes down even to the monetary level. It has to do with basically all those things that have to do with survival. The more oxytocin means more bonding, means more trust.
means you see others more as being part of you.
So here's the question.
yourself.
If you are constantly interacting with humans and they are constantly betraying you, is it good for your survival to continue to trust?
No.
The answer is no. So theoretically, based upon your local group of jackasses that are constantly betraying you, you should then also default to less trust. However, if those individuals around you are all acting in a trustworthy fashion, then you should also be more trusting and more unified with them so that your group can compete with other groups. So basically, you become more individual, and individual is both good and bad, but as an individual you're tearing down the systems of
Cohesion,
cooperation.
yeah.
As an individual, you are, there's a good and bad to cohesion and group cohesion, which could also be groupthink, but it can also be
Mob mentality.
that is what makes civilization possible. It's both things
Cooperation, yeah.
simultaneously. And being an individual, allows you to come to new conclusions, to discover new things, to break from orthodoxy, and
cause revolution.
Find the new way to, instead of being stuck in your little place where there's been a recent drought and all that shit.
But it's also war. It's also
everybody else will be afraid to change the system, and you as an individual will not be thinking the same as them. You'll say, no, fuck that. We need to all go and look and notice how stressful situation means people betraying each other and competing more, means more individuals, means more individual thinking and breaking from the norm, which means adaptation to negative circumstances. So it's
right.
pretty
If
obvious
everyone
how
becomes an individual, you have war, nonstop war.
Of course,
because nobody's cooperating.
Right. So this is a system. This is a systems design principle look at how the brain has these various interactions. So of course, fear defeats love. But then from a different perspective, love actually tends to defeat fear as well in a different way.
So would it be fair to say, John 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear?
Yes, it would be accurate to say that from a neuroscience perspective. So one of the things that happens when you have this activation of these oxytocin neurons is that you have greater executive function. So fear tends to, whenever there is a lowering of executive function, like there's less activation of the orbital frontal cortex.
Also something that happens in autism in women in particular, actually.
Interesting. So the greater the amount of fear activation, the more that the various parts of executive function are found to be disabled, and other parts of the brain start taking over.
And
however, when there
laymen,
is more love, when there is more, that actually does lead to a more stable activation of specifically the orbital frontal cortex, which is more in line with long-term thinking, with a variety of executive function, self-control based things.
I just wanted to give a layman's definition of what executive function means, because we use it so frequently in psychology. Well, in neuroscience too, but in psychology and brain science, you throw around the word executive function, but then it's like, what does that mean? Theoretically, that's the thing. It's the very front of the forehead, prefrontal cortex, and the frontal cortex in general, and that's the area that quote unquote makes us human, as what we think humans are, like all the planning for the future.
And of course, this is an oversimplification, because what makes us human also has to do with our deeper instincts and things like that.
But I mean, like, how? That's why I tried to quantify it as
the higher self, the thoughtful self, the thinking.
Because some people will try to divide humans from other animals and say that the executive functioning is what makes us different and special, and of course we don't.
It's also what can make us more sociopathic and more like a computer and more capable of things like being a what's it called, a serial killer.
Yeah.
You know, they're being completely disconnected from all of that.
From the instinctual,
the instinctual emotions of that allow us to feel, you know, things like beauty and, you know, all those things that are
be emotionally
essential
moved
to the
and-
character of being human. So there's things that are essential to the character of being human that are more animal-like.
Right.
You know, that whenever we say that this makes us human,
Yeah.
you gotta really
I see what you
qualify
mean.
there.
I see what you mean. Yeah, right. This is what makes us a thinking Homo sapien that is different from the animal.
Right,
Ugh.
right. And that is good in its own
Yeah.
way and bad in other ways.
And I don't necessarily exactly agree that we are that different from
We're really not
other
that
animals
different,
because you know the dolphins demonstrate ability to postpone instant gratification. Octopi and even freaking pigs do math at a certain level that is like, okay, clearly other animals have levels of intelligence that we are ignoring because they don't speak the same language we do.
The corvids and they hold crow court, for fuck's sake, and they actually punish those who've been stealing from youth. And of course they operate machines. They actually understand,
Create tools.
They create tools and understand concepts of displacement.
And they can practically speak the human language.
They had them like doing these experiments like where they had them using different objects to put them into water and they actually understood the hydraulic principles.
A bird would.
And
a bird would.
I know, wouldn't they? but and we're using their understanding of displacement, and they said they did all these various tests. It was so fucking cool.
I love corvids so much.
Oh, I know, it's crazy. I mean, it's crazy what they do with that tiny little fucking brain.
I'm so goth. I love bats. I love crows. Actually, no, ravens. I don't like crows that much. I like ravens.
But well, I mean, these are crows. They're
I guess
they're so closely related.
In
Corvids,
Russia, in Russia, we had ravens that were the smart ones, and then we had crows that were like had the white bellies, and they were just like dumb birds that didn't matter. So that's why I have this like a Russian association between crows and ravens that isn't necessarily accurate. No. But anyway, oxytocin. And so we're talking about executive functioning and how what you're saying is that when people are more fearful, they actually make dumb fucking retarded decisions and act like idiots.
Right. So you basically pump a population full of fear, and they will become more short-term thinking. In other words, they
become dumb criminals. I'm sorry, it's just
and you start living in the moment so much that you destroy the future. You can live in the future so much that you destroy the moment. In other words, where everything is planning and accumulating and thinking about the future. And so life itself becomes not worth living. And then there's living life so much in the moment that you destroy your options for the future. You save nothing for the future because think about it. If we really believe that the world was going to end tomorrow, would any of us do anything at all like we normally do? Fuck no.
Actually end tomorrow? I don't know, man. I feel like learned helplessness is...
Yeah, but I'm saying that in other words...
If we had evidence, if the world was falling apart, if the aliens...
there was literally... You could see a fucking... a giant meteorite coming to fucking nuke the living shit out of us. Right.
People nobody would differently.
Right. It'd be completely fucking different because... And the truth of the matter is when you get a society believing in the end of the world a whole lot, and when you get a people who believe in the end of the world a whole lot, their actual thinking starts to change because they're not going to polish brass on a sinking ship. They're going to try to...
Seize the moment.
They're not going to have
put no faith in tomorrow.
Extremely, and there's different levels of long-term versus short-term thinking. There's short-term thinking, which is in the order of minutes, and then there's short-term thinking that's on the order of like months and things like that. That still can be short-term thinking. Because the in the span of a human lifetime, you have to have different orders of magnitude.
Right.
And so
it's short-term thinking frequently because it goes against a better future if you just thought long-term. Right. So it's bad.
And short-term thinking can even be considered a single decade can still be considered short-term thinking. You have to look at it in the context of what group of people you're talking about.
Your definition for short-term thinking is specifically something that will prevent greater benefit in the totality of your future.
Right, and the thing is. What is you? What your group? Your
immediate life, your children, 7 generations from you.
Yeah, there's a variety of considerations.
How long term are you going to think?
How long term are you thinking? And so that's why there's this interaction of scales, and various scales have longer term versus shorter term, and so there's it's kind of hard to quantify because of the various level. You have to look at it from all these other scales. So the point here is that when you're talking about things like group survival and the betterment of civilization, then there is a type of short-term thinking that can be, based on, months or even years. When you're talking about the good of a civilization, that's a very long-term thing. Civilizations have a lifespan of, hundreds of years. And so short-term thinking can be, leading to the destruction of a civilization, can be only thinking in 10 years into the future. And so when you have a group of people who are very much about habitually full of fear and extreme individuality, what they will eventually lead towards is short-term thinking on behalf of civilization. However, they are thinking more.
Is that how civilizations
sometimes they
collapse?
can be, of course, that's part of it. It's the short-term thinking isn't necessarily even thinking per se, as much as it is the way that various systems are organized. It isn't necessarily even the thinking about it, but there is a necessity, there's a necessity to accumulate goods, and there's a necessity to have planning.
We have
However,
instincts,
hoarding
instincts and
right.
such.
And so, but then an overage of that, of course, can lead to accumulation in certain places that don't lead to the proper distribution, which do not then lead to the health of the. When you think of the civilization as an animal, holy shit! You almost spilled the shit out of that. Okay.
Keeping you on your toes.
Yes, almost spilled
bunch of paint,
nail polish all over everything. That was entertaining. Okay. So we're talking about these various plans. So
speaking of planning,
when you're talking about from an evolutionary standpoint, evolution has all these scales in there. In other words, there are these short-term and long-term considerations that have a harmony between these scales. And so of course there are these. That's when these what will look like opposites are actually two parts of the same system, that you have to be able to adapt to short-term thinking, and you have to be able to adapt to situations. And so our brains are designed around these things. So animals that are stressed or humans that are stressed will change their behavior, and you can find these direct correlations between the way that the systems are modulated by stressing factors.
And it leads directly to DNA being expressed in areas that
methylation of
previously,
DNA, talking about changes to epigenetics.
The histones.
Like basically you find in
whole machinery.
In mothers that have undergone famine, their children are far more likely to be gamblers.
The Dutch hunger,
right.
the Dutch winter hunger. It was a great longitudinal study about that.
Right. So you see these very direct setups of the way in which brains are going after a reward, how short term is their thought, whether they're focused upon the rules or focused upon exceptions.
They found that people who were born in colder climates versus hot climates have different levels of storing brown adipose tissue between themselves. So people who are born in different climates will gain more weight than people born in a different climate, just based on how their body stores the brown adipose tissue.
Yeah. So there's a lot of impacts of epigenetics as well. So that's one of the things that's only been the past decade or so that people have understood exactly how much modulation of DNA occurs from an individual's experience.
Starting conditions, as we call them.
Right. So anyhow, of course, making a population more and more fearful is a good way of making them more and more short-term thinking, and so it's very valuable for instance, advertisers and things like that to make everyone full of fear. And because when you are in a more short-term thinking sort of perspective, then of course you're going to be more of a gambler, more of a the world is ending. So of course you have to impulse buy. You have to get as much as you can as quickly as you can, and don't.
And what's the problem with getting the sweeties?
Right. And right.
Day after day after day.
And sharing and cooperating is a very bad idea. In other words, okay, so say for instance you wanted to design a group of animals to make sure to live through famine. So it's going to be a famine that impacts the entire species. you want to make sure that they live through it, but there's too many of them to live through the entire famine. So therefore, if the species does not reduce its population, they will all die as a group.
Right.
And therefore, the genetics will be lost. So therefore, the only genes that would live, of course, are the ones that were designed properly. And so instead of thinking of it from design, it is what happens to squeeze through, of course. It's just easy to think of it from a design perspective.
Well, you did set up the thought experiment as if we are designing a creature.
So the point is then what you need those creatures to do then is when things are more stressful, for them to compete so that the very best of the best learned genetics and things like that are the only thing that's left. It is damaging to the group. In other words, you're losing more of the overall group, but you're making sure that the very best are the only ones that live through, because only a few can live through in the first place. However, at the same time, the reason why you don't, well then why not have every single genetic be the very best of the best? So just have one line of genetics. Why not have that? Well, because of course, if a virus comes along, it exploits the sameness of them. If you need to be able to have all these different possible adaptations, because what if the drought is only for one specific type of food, and those that adapted to this one particular situation of 10,000 different possible situations are the ones that live through and happen to be the fittest? Then what was needed to have achieved that particular adaptation is tons of variation. You had to have had variation. So then when resources are good, you want to keep as many different body plans, as many different behavioral plans, as many different plans as you possibly can, so that when it becomes lean, there is something that fits the perfect niche of that unknown. And so of course biology tends to do this. Whenever there is plenty, you want differentiation as much as possible to fit all those possibilities that you cannot plan for. You cannot know the future. So therefore it is the deviation in all of those various things that are what allow you to be able to survive the next iteration of difficulty. So of course you have to have this paring down and gearing up sort of ability in the same animal. So the differentiation has to be there. You have to be having the altruism, for instance. Altruism, part of why it's there is you want to save as many of those that are. So one of the things that you think about, like whenever you're developing a new any kind of new system in evolution, is going to have these partial intermediary stages that are not perfect. And so how is it that if you have it perfectly pared down to only the most perfectly effective possible set of genes doing only the most efficient thing that it can possibly do, then you don't have any partial attempts that are seeking towards something that it's not quite there, it's not quite good enough yet. You cannot develop those mutations which are not yet useful, but if they continue forward to a certain place will then become useful. So those intermediary areas are destroyed by over efficiency. So therefore you have to have inefficiency as part of the system. It has to be built in. You have to have those inefficient models to be able to make it through those intermediary periods to the next point at which a system that is started to develop actually reaches full competitive ability. Do it. So why is all that important? So we're talking about love and fear.
Yeah.
So
you're talking about like animals having altruism, and I was just about to launch into how all the different examples in which animals.
So that is the perspective of love.
So why did you go into that tangent?
Specifically to talk about what it is that altruism does. Part of what altruism does is growth, differentiation, saving those things that are inefficient, saving the broken and the dysfunctional and all of those things that we can look at from our short-term perspective that looks like it's dysfunctional. Here, look at this person who's got autism. Let's cure autism. Right. Look at this person who's slightly
depression,
depressed or schizophrenic. Let's cure them. Well, curing them is elimination of those things that are partially effective. And sometimes those partially effective things are
a single human needs to be able to impact, to do certain things, to interact with another human, because systems work in groups sometimes where only parts of the process is accomplished by one of the units.
Yeah,
so because we are a society,
why you're expecting the unit to be the whole.
the whole, exactly. Sometimes it is not one person who creates a new system that humanity needs, but it is multiple people doing part of the job. And so some of these people who look dysfunctional from the perspective of a single individual are actually extremely functional from the perspective of the group. And so it is this understanding of group dynamics. It is the understanding that group competition is a crucial part of how competition works. That is only begun to be understood once we advanced evolutionary game theory and began to understand that there is this crucial part of competition that is group competition, that groups have to be cohesive, they have to be able to work together. And that's where love comes from. That is this unification with differentiation. That is how and that's why multicellular organisms are not just a bunch of the same cells. We're not fungal mats. We have a liver, we have a heart, we have kidneys, we have all these different things that are different inside one single unit. And the same thing is true of groups. We have different individuals of a group playing the roles of these different subsections of the larger group, allowing it to have a synergy that makes it more of a cohesive group. And so that's where that differentiation comes from. So, and that is the principle of love that we're talking about here, love versus fear. Fear is more about breaking down and pairing, trying to find the most efficient, most effective reduction down to the boiling it down, because that is necessary, that is part of the process, but you have to have both. And so that's why both are there in
love is
the design
overage and
right.
Fear is a cutting.
Yeah, exactly.
And
love is growth and fear is pruning. Yes.
Shall we get into the science now?
Yes.
All right, I have the science. So a lot of cool stuff that's sort of arranged, but I don't know which one you want to talk about first.
Well, one of the things, let me put a caveat here,
sure.
that a lot of times we talk about vasopressin as the part of the male bonding hormone, right, as opposed to oxytocin. However, males do also use oxytocin, so there is a little bit of a confusion there that'll sometimes come up when people are first encountering this thing with oxytocin, whenever I am focused on specifically oxytocin.
And we did start off with talking about oxytocin and bonding and all that, so I do have some pair bonding information about it, but then I have just information about specifically the relationship between oxytocin and opioids, kappa opioids, specifically the fear. Where should I start?
Start wherever, and I'll make sure to weave it back together into a cohesive whole.
Here's a fun thing. Let's start with a fun thing.
Okay.
So, according to primate studies, endogenous opioid peptide, aka endorphins, receptor genes have been implicated in social relationships. So here we're talking about mu opioids, I guess, or just all the opioids, all three of them.
Could be all three.
Because they're saying example endorphins, but they're talking about endogenous opioid peptide. Mm-hmm. That feels like it's all three. Mm-hmm. Kappa, delta, and mu. Mm-hmm.
They're definitely mu is definitely part of the reward system for social interaction.
Okay, so it's mu then. Mm-hmm. Endogenous opioid peptide receptor gene has been implicated in social relationships in primates. Although our results with oxytocin and opiate gene variants should be regarded as preliminary due to relatively low size, they suggest that oxytocin and opioid mu1 gene variants in dogs affect human-directed social behavior, and their effects differ between breeds. So, dog domestication is a relationship of oxytocin and mu opioids, and that's how dogs are domesticated.
Oh yeah,
it's through oxytocin.
Yeah, that was one of the things I found very early in my oxytocin research, is that golden retrievers were one of the ones that had the very highest.
And that's what they're talking about.
They actually take to
not specifically. I don't mean golden retrievers specifically, but the fact that they do cover border collies, German shepherds.
I've been looking for that study forever because I lost it, and by the way, I spent the past hour before this podcast, whatever it is that we're doing,
Live stream.
this live stream. I spent an hour
This discussion.
looking for anywhere that my delicious bookmarks might have been
Aw.
somewhere, because I had some of the best goddamn research on oxytocin in my delicious bookmarks, and they're gone forever now.
So they did specifically look at, so they were looking at Siberian Huskies that frequently have an allele that is the same as wolves. So they were using Siberian Huskies as a wolf type, which did not show any difference in association in these genes in the Siberian Huskies. However, German Shepherds and Border Collies did have a difference. So we have that's how they were like, okay, well, the animal that is more wild, that is more like a wolf, they don't actually show these differences in oxytocin and mu opioids like much more domesticated animals like German Shepherds and Border Collies, which are traditionally helper animals specifically. German Shepherds are police dogs. Border Collies are, shepherd dogs. So they work closely with humans and cooperate with humans to accomplish tasks.
Let me give one other crucial little thing that I don't often bring up, that is kind of part of, this is going to be quick, but it's just basically that that dynorphin is one of the major differences between chimpanzees and humans, and when it comes to the genes in that are implicated in the morphology and all of those things with the brain. In other words, whenever we find the expression of genes in the brain, dynorphin is extremely different, one of the most extremely different between us and chimpanzees. So it may be related to the differences in our cognitive abilities between chimps and humans may actually be related to dynorphin.
And that is essentially kappa opioids.
Yes, kappa opioids.
AKA fear.
Right.
The thing, dynorphin, so it's endorphin, dynorphin, endorphins are the positive pain relievers, and dynorphins are the things that is called place aversion, or instead of place preference, which is where you get conditioned place aversion. Okay.
Well, I mean, I think technically dynorphin is an endorphin, but it's just
whatever. All right, sure. Well, there's the endorphins that induce pain relief and make you and reward and make you feel good, and then there's dynorphins that make you feel bad. And so people, you can cause conditioned place aversion in animals and people, but they've done studies with animals where when you administer a negative stimulus in a particular area, the creature will not want to be in that area, and that's what dynorphins do. And that's how we expressed earlier. That is a method by which you prevent the creature, the animal, from hurting itself to get the reward of endorphins. Is you introduce dynorphin that tells it, that sucked, don't do that again.
Yeah, it's a very strong don't do that.
So what you're saying is there is a in terms of that presence of that chemical and dynorphin, humans are more similar to bonobos
well, I don't know about the the similarity between bonobos and
you're saying just chimps and humans are different,
right?
Oh, okay.
I do not know if there may be a difference between bonobos and chimps.
I misunderstood them.
Yeah, there may be. Actually, I thought the funny thing
I
is
may be remembering things.
The funny thing is I thought of that, and there may be a difference between chimps and bonobos, because I know that bonobos are closer to humans than chimps are, that wasn't known for some time, but that's now a thing. But yeah, it could be, but I'm just saying that when it comes to genetic differences, that is one of the more identifiable ones. If you'd like for me to read that article that you had started as like, that's my mate, the article, I can do that.
Sure, but that's more about pair bonding, just to prove. That was mostly just like, hey, oxytocin has to do with love, here's proof. But I don't know if our audience needs that, if they just believe us or they're like, sure, move on. Sure, we'll take it for granted and move on.
But it was still interesting to have
because it's basically an order of, we start off with, hey, pair bonding, oxytocin does this thing. Then we go into PubMed relationship between oxytocin and kappa opioids, and then we end with, for instance, an article that supplements the evidence that oxytocin regulates nociception and presents additional material for clinical application of oxytocin as an analgesia drug. So it directly love and pain and fear through the mediate of pain, that is fear.
Well, also, there's actually,
pain,
I
love, all
I can
that.
link it to schizophrenia even. Part of like a lack of love, basically leading towards schizophrenia. I can show how through 5-HT2A and its relationship to both mu opioids and to oxytocin.
Right, and
right.
because of course there was a great TED talk on it, and we have studies of oxytocin modulating opioid addiction.
Mm-hmm.
It is literally our disconnection and lack of love that is fueling the goddamn fucking opioid epidemic.
Yeah, it really is. Like directly. You
directly.
can track it down in the neuroscience.
Oh, so frustrating. Then there's
Well, but there's no profit in understanding the way the brain works when you can just throw shit at a wall and make a huge profit by giving people drugs that you have no fucking clue what they do. And,
but you do know the side effects.
And,
that they
there's
have.
like 800 million side effects. You're gonna explode and bleed out and kill everyone. And but ask your doctor if you happen to destroy the planet while you're what? We've just been recently watching a show where just the
Yeah, we're watching a show that's on a
CBS.
Yeah, it's on CBS All Access, which we're
And they just
we're not paying for it, so we can't complain. But it is a gift. So
but it constantly has these advertisements of and it's like they've gotten worse and
instead
worse.
of being annoyed at them because they're all medical, we're just like raptly interested in all the side effects and just like playing side effect bingo.
Yeah, the side effects, they've just gotten worse and worse and worse. And obviously, it's like, I think what it is how they get away with that is that, well, people are like, well, the doctor wouldn't give me something that's bad for me. That must be a really rare. No, that's not what it is. It's just people assume that. So, of course, those things still keep selling because of the unholy alliance between pharmaceutical companies and the kickbacks.
An appeal to authority
things like that occur with. I mean, they're not kickbacks. They're just taking all these doctors on cruises and giving them, all these things. Just
there's no corruption in America.
No
That's only in
corruption.
Russia. Only Russia's corrupt.
That's true. It's only Russia.
America's never corrupt.
Right. So,
There's also neat stuff about dopamine and oxytocin-induced penile erection and yawning and how it affects nitric oxide. So that's some cool stuff.
ooh,
Just for us.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's sexy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oxytocin terminals display a powerful opioid-mediated autoinhibitory mechanism. Demonstrated copy opioids inhibit oxytocin secretion. So here's how fear blocks love.
Yeah. Well, let's go through it one at a time, though.
Okay, so back off stranger, sure.
Yeah, sure. And you needed to run off for a second while I read this, right?
Yeah. You guys gotta be. And that one's being shown on the screen so that people could read along if they wanted to. I'm just letting you know as you scroll if it scrolls along.
Right, gotcha. Okay. All right, back off, stranger. That's my mate. The role of kappa opioid receptors. All right. We've all heard the legendary monogamous prairie vole, haven't we? Our adorable rodent friend forms the kind of attachments that make us humans feel slightly ashamed of our more promiscuous habits. And of course, we know about prairie voles. We know about, if we know about prairie voles, we know about oxytocin. And I've got a whole series on it over at the Science 101 page of my other site. Prairie voles are monogamous primarily due to the actions of oxytocin in the female and vasopressin in the male. With these two hormones, the prairie voles will love them and leave them, just like, without these two hormones, the prairie voles will love them and leave them just like their close cousins, the meadow vole. But is that all there really is to pair bonding? Just one hormone, a desire to stay with your furry mate forever, and that's it? No, it's more complicated than that. Resendez et al. K-opioid receptors within the nucleus accumbens shall mediate pair bond maintenance. There are two real aspects to pair bond. The first is the prosocial bit, the animal preferring to associate with one particular other animal. In voles, this requires the hormones oxytocin and vasopressin and the neurotransmitter dopamine. But there's another aspect to pair bonding, maintenance. And that requires more than fuzzy feelings. It also requires rejection of other potential mates and guarding your mate against all comers. This aggressive behavior also involves dopamine, but in this case, a different population of receptors. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter which we often associate with rewarding properties of things. More properly, dopamine signaling in areas of the brain, like the nucleus accumbens, is associated with something that we scientists call salience, or how much we need to be paying attention to something. Often this is associated with reward. You need to be paying attention if you want to win, but it's also associated with other behaviors, like the formation and maintenance of pair bonds. And dopamine is only good as the receptors that are involved with it. In the case dopamine, the receptors are pretty simple. There are, wait a minute. In the case dopamine, the receptors are pretty simple. There are D1-like receptors and D2-like receptors, as opposed to serotonin, which has around 17 types of receptor, all of which do different things. D1-like and D2-like receptors occur in different sets of neurons in the nucleus accumbens. This means that pair bond formation can rely mostly on D1-like receptor-containing neurons, while aggressive behaviors of pair bond maintenance can rely on the D2-like receptor-containing neurons. And I'll break for just a moment here to point out that D2-like receptors are also implicated in schizophrenia. And continuing forward, and the D2-like receptor containing neurons are themselves part of a network. In this case, they are part of a network which involves kappa opioid receptors. Opioid receptors are aptly named for their ability to bind to things like the opiates, morphine, heroin, etc. But these receptors also bind ligands that are endogenous. They are made by the body and are normally present. And of course, opioid receptors also come in different flavors, including mu, best known for pain-killing abilities, and kappa. The authors of this study wanted to look at the role of kappa opioid receptors in the aggressive behaviors that male prairie voles showed during pair bond maintenance. To look at this, they gave doses of kappa opioid receptor antagonist. Antagonist is something that blocks it, and then exposed pair bonded voles to an intruder in their cage.
Term, right? Antagonist.
Right. Yeah, an antagonist blocks up a
Provoking,
receptor
but it's
and does not allow the ligand or ligand. A ligand is just the word for the chemical. That, in other words, it can bond to that particular receptor because it's like kind of like a key in a keyhole, but more like a cup and a ball, but it's a very complex cup and a very complex ball. Let's see. Okay, so they use Norbi and then expose pair bonded voles to an intruder in their cage. So they're blocking the kappa opioid receptor.
So they're blocking their fear social.
The males are on the top and the females are on the bottom in the graphs above. You can see that the males will attach an intruder. Will attach? I think they mean attack. An intruder about half the time when they are pair bonded already. But when you give them a high dose of kappa receptor antagonists, they decrease attacks. So in other words, when they are not, when their kappa, when their kappa opioids are not. So okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Let me take a second to point something out.
Yeah.
So
let's parse that, please.
Yeah, this is going to be a little bit difficult to follow if you do not understand the way in which receptors are modulated by activation. So whenever a receptor is activated, it's kind of like a voting thing. There's a lot of receptors on the neuron, and it's only when enough of them are activated within a given time period that the neuron fires. And so it's kind of, there are other things going on as well that can impact whether or not the neuron fires, but the point is that it has to reach this certain threshold for it to fire. And so one of the things that the body can do is, so you have the same amount of chemical ligand that is circulating in the fluid there, or that is released regularly. Well, one of the things that the body does that is in response to it, it tries to balance the number of receptors, which are the number of places that can be voted upon, which increases the probability that the vote will go through, or increases or decreases.
So like polling places. They closed a bunch of polling places.
So that's called down regulation. So
like in Texas.
So you get rid of
Bernie voting.
So when you get rid of the receptors, that's called down regulation. So the body will say, okay, I've got too much of this ligand is coming through, or this receptor is getting activated too much, and then the body will suck in those receptors and destroy them. Well, the neuron will, and that's called down regulation. However, there are instances where the body detects that it's not, though the ligand is present, the neuron isn't firing enough. And so that will lead to upregulation, which means it will start expressing, it'll start creating more of those little buttons to be pushed, more of those little voting, receptors. And so that the same amount of chemical can have a different effect on a neuron based upon the number of receptors are there. So it's about a probability thing. There's ligands circulating around in the fluid, and as that concentration goes up, it becomes more likely that the neuron will activate, but that can be changed by the number of total receptors that are present. So that's one of the ways that it's modulated. So you need to understand that one of the things that the body does is, in response to an overage of something, of a specific ligand, it will downregulate. In response to blocking that ligand, it will sometimes also upregulate. So there's just the understanding that there are these systems, and the body works based upon not just modulating that to kind of have a balance, but also there is a point at which it continues to upregulate to where you've got tons of it, and then a huge exposure leads to a huge downregulation, and that is actually part of a larger system. So the body purposefully has these cycles where it'll have more and more receptors, and then some threshold event will, because of the receptors being more and more there, can cause it to then lead to this huge downregulation. So these cycles going back and forth between how many receptors are there, so therefore changing how likely it is that a given neuron will fire. So understanding all of that is kind of important to what they're talking about here. So I'm going to try to continue forward from there with hopefully a little better understanding. I hope I did that well. Talking about the males and females on the graph, which I did not see a graph here. Where's this graph? I don't see a graph. Maybe it's below. Yes. Okay. So when you give them a kappa receptor antagonist, they decrease attacks. So that means an antagonist it's something that that latches onto the receptors and makes it where the ligand cannot touch it, so that it cannot activate it, so that the neuron will become less likely to fire. So therefore, what they're saying here is that kappa receptor neurons are not firing in this case of them giving them this particular chemical. You'll also note that this applies only to the males. The females have no effect. In contrast, the doses of a mu receptor antagonist had no effect, showing that it's not a general opiate receptor thing. It's specific to the kappa receptors. So in other words, by blocking it, they let's go back to what was the they decrease attacks when kappa opioid receptors are not being activated. So that's they're doing lots of negatives here. Basically, they become more aggressive when kappa opioids are being activated. So once again, what I was saying about kappa opioids being right,
you're less aggressive.
Right, blocking fear, less aggression. Right. So but where's this interaction taking place? The authors hypothesized the kappa receptors that were important in aggressive behaviors would be those in the nucleus accumbens. And by the way, the nucleus accumbens is part of the reward center, right? You have the nucleus accumbens, and the striatum, which is made up of that's made up of two components that I'm not remembering exactly right now. But there are these various areas. The nucleus accumbens is the one that is most directly associated with reward, but there's also the pitumen and the caudate nucleus. I believe that's correct.
Pitumen and caudate nucleus.
Right. And so those are all kind of part of this same
the VTA.
Right. There's
a whole system.
Labeling of
pathway,
the right. Exactly.
The
labeling of
words.
the areas are sometimes overlapping. Okay. So look at this. They microinjected the kappa antagonist into several areas of the brain.
I would like to show some graphs to the audience, but we don't see any yet.
Yeah, I don't know why. Here you can see the results of the microinjection on male and female aggressive behaviors in pair-bonded voles. When they microinjected artificial cerebrospinal fluid, the control, there was no effect on the aggression. The paired male voles attacked anyway. They also got no difference from the nucleus accumbens, core, or ventral pallidum. The 2 sets of bars on the right. Well, wherever that is, I'd like to see these bars.
Should we accept their cookies? Is that like part of it? I don't
Yeah, I
understand.
definitely accept the cookies, but that didn't do anything.
No.
Okay.
Well, we can just go to the original science paper right there.
Where?
I think that's it. Linking.
Okay, we'll go to that. We'll go to that in a minute. All right. But when they microinjected the kappa antagonist in the nucleus accumbens shell region, the males and the females both ceased their attacks on intruders, suggesting that the kappa opioid receptors in the nucleus accumbens shell specifically, where they can have effects on dopamine receptor containing neurons, mediate the aggressive tendencies of the bonded voles. Kappa receptors are usually thought to mediate things like aversive states, like depressive like behaviors and anxiety. But it looks like in this case, kappa opioid receptors are partially responsible for inducing a suite of aggressive behaviors. So remember that whole fear at the base of it, but then there's actually that aggression and things like that are also part of fear. That's actually what they're kind of expressing here.
Yeah.
That
the complexities that are overlaid over the spectrum of love and fear.
Right. This is pretty interesting for a couple of reasons. First, it lets us know, as all people in long-term relationships can attest, that there's more to a pair bond than just the formation. There's also maintenance, and that's a separate set of behaviors than those first warm and fuzzy feelings. Secondly, this study gives us insight into the different mechanisms in the brain behind the maintenance of the pair bond. These may not be the same in humans. After all, we don't start getting aggressive to every other person just because we have a partner.
Kind of do.
But it does show how different mechanisms can interact, kappa receptors and dopamine receptors, adding another step to complexity, seemingly simple behaviors.
But it's not just a stranger, it's a stranger of an opposite sex invading your space, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little different. That's called jealousy, folks.
Yeah. So let's see if we can actually open this up and
get
look
us
at
some graphs. Nope.
No, we cannot.
All
Okay.
right. I can look it up though and try to find some graphs.
I think the whole point here is specifically that there is a part of the kappa opioid system, which the way that they linked it was very general. They're saying, well, we've determined that kappa opioids are somehow linked here. Well, yeah, kappa opioids are very directly linked to dopamine. That's the change of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens that happens after acute administration of kappa opioid receptors, is that at first there is a sensitivity, then it goes down, and then it rises sharply. So some of the things that I've tried to point out numerous times is there is a profile of changes to dopamine in the nucleus accumbens that is part of aging and part of animals that have been stressed. There are all these changes that lead to a addiction profile. So in other words, the way that the dopamine receptors look in an addicted animal are a specific way, and when you administer acute kappa opioid agonists, which means you are strongly activating the kappa opioid system, which will lead to downregulation. So in other words, first you activate it, then the body goes, oh shit, I've got too many of these receptors, and gets rid of them, which would then afterwards, the long-term effect is that it will be less likely for them to activate. So that's like antagonism. So let me say that again. The acute agonism leading to downregulation, which is the removal of them. So in other words, a high amount of the chemical leads to a reduction of the receptor, which means in the future that receptor will be less likely to activate. So therefore, having a high dose of kappa opioids will give the immediate effects of the negative, etc. But then afterwards, it will be less likely to happen because of the body then gets rid of those receptors. Well, downstream of that, what occurs is that there is an upregulation of dopamine receptors in the reward areas of the brain. So it actually, to put that in shorter terms, basically the changes that happen to a brain that has become addicted to all the various addictive drugs, the changes that occur, like dopamine goes up in one and goes down in the other, and there's these specific profile of changes that are across a wide variety of bad states in the reward center of the brain. Those do exactly the opposite in after 1 week whenever you have acute administration of kappa opioid. So in other words, so the huge flush of fear. So therefore, what I'm saying here is somebody who there's another way to release kappa opioids, by the way, and that is extreme exercise or extreme heat. Both of those also release it. But after a huge negative thing occurring.
I wanted to get back to this.
Okay, I'm almost done. I know, I'm sorry. But after a huge negative thing occurring, then what happens is so in other words, if you happen to face your fears, overcome some difficulty, then in return for that, all of life is more satisfying and you're more calm and you're less aggressive.
So what was all this about?
Just basically talking about the whole relationship between dopamine and kappa opioids, which they were saying was part of the pair bonding. It's not just part of pair bonding. It's a huge system that is part of the whole reward and fear sort of system.
So you're saying that when you reduce fear, the whole life is more rewarding because of how it affects
because it
the
literally
dopamine system.
basically what's happening with somebody who is addicted is everything is less rewarding, and so that there's a profile of down regulation, fewer dopamine receptors in one area, more dopamine receptors
Well, we know
in
that,
another.
but what does that have to do with oxytocin and kappa opioids?
Because what that has to do with this, so I was talking about what they were talking about in the article,
Right,
which was they
so
were
I
giving
wanna
a
get
very
back to.
general connection between and saying that they were connected.
What the
They
hell's
are
naloxone?
connected. What?
What's naloxone?
Naloxone is a mu-opioid antagonist, I'm pretty sure.
Because now that I'm looking at the study, there's a lot more in the actual
Right.
fully available article. Bless. There's like a lot more, but what you're saying is in the article they described a relationship between the reward pathway and kappa opioids or oxytocin.
They were just saying,
Or they're hinting at it.
They're saying there's a connection, and they're not really talking about the connection. That there's a connection between pair bonding and kappa opioids, but the way in which they presented it was specifically that
Through the reward pathway.
it was kind of a not a very good way of connecting it, and so I
Gotcha.
was trying to point out the way in which it actually is connected, and it has to do with the sensitization of the reward system. It has to do with
Which is that's what it's called when you the frequency or the availability of receptors is how sensitized or desensitized the system is.
right. So there is whenever I mean, they didn't actually bring it up in here, but whenever there is a higher amount of tone of the oxytocin, the various places in the brain where oxytocin is active, when there's more active there, you actually have a reduction in the total activation of things like kappa opioids. In other words, those kappa opioid receptors are then less active. So in other words, that is basically becoming less aggressive, etc., which leads back to what you were talking about with the dogs and things like that, with them being the dogs that are domesticated being less aggressive in general. It has to do with the way in which these systems are interacting with each other.
And yeah, there's
When you have more love and less fear, you're generally
what do you know? It's also a little confusing, or rather, it's confusing is not the right word, but it's there's another layer of complexity because we are talking about opioids. We're talking about kappa opioid, which is fear, but so frequently there's also mu opioids involved with pain relief and endorphins, analgesia, all of that. So that's something that kind of sticks out like a third wheel, but or a third spoke, or
and then we could
fifth
start
wheel,
we could jump off into autism here and how it is that social social fears related to the way in which the mu opioids are not rewarding, or are or you have too much reward. So there's all these
right. So I'd like to simplify, but it's difficult because the opioids is such a big part of the whole system.
And you're talking about such a very central part of the brain, and so it spider
so
webs
big.
out in 1,000 different directions, and it's hard to pick just one of them because all of them are implicated. And whenever you pick just one, you have to oversimplify. There's always oversimplification that's necessary when we're talking about complex systems like this, and we're only talking about one part of it. It's connected to all the rest of them.
I wonder if that's the exact same study that they're referencing in a different article. They do have another one, December 2005. No, that can't be it. Let's see. Yeah, no, completely different. Way like a long time ago. Austin Native American and New Scientist, our favorites from back in the day. So, the secret to everlasting love. Let me show you guys some cute voles. There we go. They're very cute. Look at them. These are voles. And yes, that is their position that was drawn in the article.
Uh-huh.
That's a picture. We got this artist rendition of how they show affiliation to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And here's an actual image of them being just like that. So let's read that one. And that one is actually exactly what you're talking about, but hopefully expounded on it, because dopamine blockers lead faithful voles astray. So here's how the whole dopamine thing works with all that. The secret to everlasting love may lie in a specific region of the brain activated by the brain chemical dopamine. The rodents usually form lifelong monogamous pair bonds with their mating partners, but researchers found that by manipulating certain dopamine receptors in specific regions, they could disrupt the relationship and even cause them to become unfaithful. Brandon Argona at Florida State University in Tallahassee and colleagues examined the love affair that develops between prairie voles. After mating once, the male prairie vole not only prefers the company of his mate, but will act aggressively towards other available females. His female partner displays a similar commitment, showing hostility towards other interested male voles. Hence the article we just talked about a minute ago. And how blockers of kappa opioids modulate this aggressive behavior. The researchers found that after a single mating encounter, large amounts of neurotransmitter dopamine are released into the nucleus accumbens, the subcortical region of the brain that is also involved in motivation and development of addiction. Dopamine release is associated with reorganization of brain circuitry that changes the region of the brain promoting pair bonding, Dude explained. He investigated the role played by two dopamine receptors, D1 and D2, on pair bonding by injecting chemicals into the vole's nucleus accumbens that either activated or blocked the receptor. Argona's team discovered that D2 receptors are activated during the first mating encounter, which results in pair bond formation. After extended cohabitation with the female, however, there was a significant increase in stimulation of D1 receptor, which led to aggressive behavior towards other females. Blocking D1 at this point prevented the aggression. The researchers also found that a virgin male adult injected with a D2 activating chemical formed an instant and lasting pair bond with the nearest female. Sad. Even if she were not sexually active and no mating took place. Aww, one-itis though. Poor virgin male adults. The injection also triggered aggressive behavior towards other females, even ones that offered sex. D1 activation in virgin males conversely prevented them from committing to a female in the first place. Interesting. In addition, when the male from a long-term cohabitation relationship was injected with a D1 blocker, he suddenly stopped acting aggressively towards other females and began playing the field. So yeah, seems like D2 is the pair bond, D1 is turning away from others, not having motivation to seek others.
Yeah, in
the opposite
in
of
this specific context.
In the specific context of nucleus accumbens, in specifically prairie voles, because they exhibit very unique rodent pair bonding. Not all rodents, not all rodents. Wow, my accent today. Pair bond in the same way. Just I can't words today.
Oh, but it does have to do with their differences in oxytocin and things like that.
Yeah, that's true. Quote, Aragona says that the strong pair bonding has evolved as a protective mechanism. Voles are small and vulnerable to predators such as snakes or birds. The most protective situation is for the pups to be looked after in a two-parent family. Prairie voles are extremely social animals. They live together in large family groups, and both females and males are extremely good and thorough parents. The answer to one of life's most pressing questions, how to make a lover commit, may therefore come down to correctly triggering their dopamine receptors. Our study shows that love is in the brain, not the heart, confirms Aragona. Interfering with dopamine receptors, though, through drug use, may also result in unwanted side effects. Antidepressants, much?
Yep.
Or recreational drugs, such as cocaine, can cause this area of the brain to be reorganized so that it doesn't respond correctly to normal signals, Aragona notes.
Yep.
It is no surprise that people in long-term stable relationships are less likely to become addicted to drugs.
Yep. And the other thing is that things like the way in which there's numerous studies that show that whenever you have a child that's like exposed to the kinds of media that were now very rewarding. In other words, there's a constant activation of reward. Basically, it modulates their brain in a way to make them more like an addicted person, and that is that everything becomes less satisfying. So basically, the constant, very quick rewards that happen. Okay, like for instance, this is a good example. Why is it that rich kids are very often depressed? Why is it that the U.S. is one of the most depressed countries in the world, with especially considering the very high standard of living? A lot of that has to do with whenever an animal has too much instantaneous reward and isn't putting off reward, it basically is kind of not our
it's
biology.
a model of addiction,
right? Our biology is not made to be able to handle that much frequency of reward, which leads to downregulation of those dopamine receptors, which means that you're desensitized to all that which is rewarding. So therefore, with everything being not rewarding, there are a variety
cocaine society, basically.
Yeah, and so you end up and then also a loveless society, basically. Too much reward, too much constant reward, and not enough putting off of gratification leads to addicted brains, and addicted brains are not capable of focusing upon focusing upon particular goals, for one thing, and also when even achieving goals are no longer as motivating because there isn't the reward. The reward is not capable of being activated in the brain.
It's not any stronger than all the other rewards coming in from just flashing commercials and things.
Flashing lights and buzzers and the whole casino of nonsense that's supposed to hype up your dopamine system. And so you're just keeping that dopamine system. Basically, all of our advertising systems, all of our media systems, all those things have basically been tricking our dopamine system.
That's what clickbait is. Clickbait is a dopamine
constantly
seek.
accessing and tricking our dopamine system to give us lots and lots and lots of little squirts of dopamine, which means our body eventually then adapts to that, and so therefore everything is dissatisfying.
They've actually talked about that with I forget the exact phrase for it, but something loop that is a psychology term of people that we get stuck in a loop of checking email, checking Twitter, refreshing every couple of minutes to try to get that reward, and it's unrewarding, but we still are somehow stuck there pulling
because
that
we're
lever.
drug addicts. Yes, because our system has made us into drug addicts.
So it's not even like it's just simple things like
the
technology.
drug comes from our own brain, but,
right?
But basically,
but also
even the system set up in your brain for downregulation, or they're not supposed to be. They're not adaptations to drug use. They're adaptations to your own brain, and so it's your body's trying to constantly have the cycle of changes, and it ends up getting locked into various states that the overall system has gotten into because we're experiencing things that our bodies were not adapted to experience. We were not adapted to have this level of novelty, this level of availability, this level of all these various things. And so by not accounting for that, because we didn't really understand exactly how much this could impact the neurological systems, we continue to deny even our the existence of these things.
And that's part of that. That's my issue with unchecked laissez-faire ideology, because what will end up being sought after is not something that is healthy. So you can't just look at demand and decide that equals value and that we should give. So it's like that's a difficult thing, is that because the dopamine is coming from our brains, the drug is coming from our brains, and what we're reacting to is just a system of communication.
Well,
it's just emails, it's just technology.
It's the idea of a rational agent is completely ridiculous. This is the problem, and it's the truth of the matter is a child will continue to eat sugar until they're sick, and they just the fact that
that's how brains work.
That the adults will do the same thing in a more complex manner is just not usually part of their perspective, but it is simply the truth, and people want to view humans as way more in control than they actually are, because we can't be aware of the various systems that are underlying our consciousness and driving us subtly towards a variety of complex things. We can't be aware of that. It's just not even fucking possible. And so of course that's why we don't plan for or adapt to or make changes or fix these systems going wrong, because we keep denying that they're actually there, even though the science is there to support it.
Keep denying our fallibility.
Right. Exactly. We are not fallible. We are in perfect control. Sure you are.
I just feel like getting a Dunkin' Donut matcha green tea frappuccino almond thing that I just saw 2 minutes ago on a commercial.
I made that decision.
No, they I've been wanting it all day, actually.
Yes, unfortunately, there's a lot of, you have to have a lack of respect for what humans are, and therefore what you yourself are. You have to have some humility about what is a mind to be able to embrace what neuroscience has been showing us for quite a while now.
Reels over feels, folks. So then the next one is localization of kappa opioid receptors in oxytocin neurons. Well, that's too complicated. Basically, they figured out that kappa opioid receptor agonists, like dynorphin, inhibit oxytocin secretion in rats. End of story. That's all. One sentence. That's all you need to know. Well, it's been demonstrated previously.
Such dynorphin inhibit oxytocin secretion in the rat. Yeah.
To determine whether kappa agonists act directly on oxytocin-containing magnocellular neurons to inhibit hormone secretion, we utilized immunofluorescence to examine it, and results suggest that kappa opioid receptor agonists can exert directly inhibitory actions on oxytocin magnocellular neurons.
Yeah. So there's
Directly, fear blocks love.
right.
Yeah.
So that is so basically pumping your populace full of fear is the worst thing you can do. Well, in the short term, if you want to have a very active economy where people are all about spending their money
And buying toilet paper, because that's what is going to cure coronavirus, apparently.
right, so you're definitely going to buying huge amounts of toilet paper and is definitely going to cure coronavirus. But the
Get your emergency prep, folks.
do it right now. Hurry up. But if you want to boost, then you pump them full of fear. But then, of course, that destroys the long-term system because you use up buffers. Whenever you are, if you looked at this from a
You
perspective
just
of
make
a
people
person,
dumb, too.
yeah, you make them dumber, more. You make society break down. Basically, when you make people more fearful, you break down society. All those things that hold them together and allow them to interact as a cohesive group. It's like going in and fucking with the systems in a human body. You can make the human body start to break down
like
its communication between its parts. If you break down the communication between the parts and you do not allow the timing that is supposed to be there, that developed naturally to be there, if you do not allow that, or you in some way block that, you can end up killing the larger animal. And it takes time to kill it. It takes a long time to stop.
To poison it, yeah.
Yeah, it takes a long time to stop a train on the tracks. There's a lot of momentum to society, but you can destroy a society through various things that are breaking down the cohesion of that society at a fundamental level. And of course, that's what we're doing in a variety of ways by playing upon people's fears and turning them into consumers.
Yeah. All right, which one's this? Let's see. What's next? Is that the one? That shouldn't be opioid addiction. That's something else. Oxytocin neuron terminals display a powerful opioid-mediated autoinhibitory mechanism which restrains secretory activity. In pregnancy, upregulation of this mechanism may underlie the accumulation of large stores of oxytocin in pituitary. In the present study, conscious pregnant rats were cannulated to allow blood samples to be taken for measuring of oxytocin secretions. Late pregnancy, there was a significant reduction. Okay, this suggests that in late pregnancy, endogenous kappa opioid restraint is downregulated. In addition, the present results demonstrate an attenuation in the potency with which choleostokinin? What is that?
Cholecystokinin.
Cholecystokinin.
Yeah.
What is that? I guess it's something that, what is it?
You'd have to look it up.
Yeah, well. So injections of the cholecystokinin evoked oxytocin release in late pregnancy. Unrelated. This doesn't seem like it has to do anything with anything. I can't have.
Okay,
I don't
well,
understand.
here's the thing. All right, there's something that they might not be mentioning here in the abstract.
There's just an abstract, right?
Is prolactin is one of the is like the prolactin release is the sine qua non of large doses of dynorphin. So in other words, when there's a large release of dynorphin, you also end up having a release of prolactin. Prolactin, of course, is related directly to lactation, etc., which is in pregnancy. But in addition to that, prolactin is directly related to neuroplasticity. So in other words, changes in the variability of the way in which the brain is connected occur after a large-scale release of dynorphin. So in addition to, so that's kind of beside some of the things that they're looking at here, which is how is it that oxytocin, there's a large release of oxytocin which occurs right after the birth of a child, for instance, and right during the birth of a child. What is the mechanism by which this large release of oxytocin occurs? And it's almost certainly has to do with the dynorphin pathway, because there is basically, so given what I've said before, I'm just guessing based on this abstract here, because I know the way that the systems end up working, is that there is that with a large release of dynorphin, there would be then the down regulation of the dynorphin receptors, and as well as a release of oxytocin that occurs in combination with that. So then you have the after effect that there's no longer as much. So like what would happen with after a mother giving birth, she would no longer have nearly as much anxiety. She would have because of the reduction of the kappa opioid receptor, which means that there's less of a likelihood of the activation of fear, etc., blocking oxytocin. So the continued release of oxytocin after the fact would all be part of that system. So it makes sense what they're saying, that there would be a large amount of kappa opioid that would occur at some point. And I'm not sure where they were saying that was happening, but that totally fits with the overarching model.
Yeah, I just I got excited because the first sentence was that oxytocin modulates secretory activity, and I'm like, yes! And didn't read the rest of it, so that one was my bad. But yeah, there is some interesting prolactin oxytocin relationship in pregnancy, and I mean, they do talk about kappa opioids in pregnancy. There is that happens. So now this one is a personal, just for us. Prevention by morphine of apomorphine and oxytocin induced penile erection and yawning. Involvement of nitric oxide. Yeah, so that's just for us. That's just funsies for us. But if you want to,
well, there is a kappa opioid. Okay,
right?
There is a connection between kappa opioids and nitric oxide. That is
explicate a little bit. Because I mean, I could read the introduction.
So nitric oxide having to do with is related to epithelium health. Nitric oxide is a very strong what's it called?
Heart protectant.
Well, no, it kills cells. What is it called? It's
Excitotoxic.
No, whenever you free radical, it's an extremely powerful free radical. So it's something. It's one of those things that the dose makes the poison. But the thing is, there are various systems in the body where what is released could seem like a poison, but when it's released in acute doses instead of chronic doses, it's like the difference between acute stress and chronic stress. One is healthy, the other is unhealthy. Acute ends up being healthy, whereas chronic is unhealthy. Same thing with nitric oxide production. So there are there's a relationship between acute administration of dynorphin and acute release of nitric oxide, and also upregulation of nitric oxide producing mRNA in heart tissue as well as in epithelial cells. So what this leads to, from a kind of a larger perspective, is that it's part of a system of killing off unhealthy cells. Acute administration of dynorphin could lead to some of the anti-senescent effects that we've seen in a variety of systems like this. So, like for instance in sauna and things like that. So go ahead.
So essentially, to underscore what you're saying, is kappa opioid agonist is a fountain of youth.
To a certain extent, yes.
Because we're destroying cells that need to die because they're
Right,
old
so in other words, facing your fears, going through difficulties, so it's heat therapy releases dynorphin, extreme, in other words,
exercise.
like breakthrough exercise. So in other words, you have to get to that point at which you that's where
I've come this far and I can go no further, and then go further.
Right, and it's a breakthrough stress, and you find that like whenever they have animals in for swim tests and things like that, that you end up having large releases of kappa opioids. So all of those things that we associate with overcoming, doing the thing that requires the difficulty of overcoming, generally ends up with a kappa opioid release. And part of the reason why it's difficult is because of the whole kappa opioid system saying don't do this.
Yeah, that's what you need to overcome. The dynorphin saying, stop this sucks, don't do this thing.
Yeah. And then that in at the long-term effect, the short-term effect is very negative. In other words, like for instance, looking at nitric oxide and the fact that it's a free radical, you could say, oh man, it's a free radical. Free radicals go and they can do damage to cells. But yeah, they can kill off sick cells when it is something that is instead, because what can happen is you can get locked in a low constant activation of kappa opioids because you have more of the receptor. So the tiniest thing,
stressed, basically.
the tiniest thing allows you to have a stress response.
That's what people with anxiety have.
Right. The tiniest amount of release ends up with a stress response because the neuron then activates to that. Whereas acute activation leads to the downregulation, which means that even though in the short term it is negative, in the long term the downregulation, which lasts longer, ends up making it where it is less likely to be activated in the future. So that's where that whole mechanism of acute versus chronic is very different. You do not want a chronic free radicals like nitric oxide circulating inside
most of anything because it leads to downregulation.
Yeah, but instead what you want is an acute release of nitric oxide, which can then kill off various cells that are damaged,
or acute blocking, which then will lead to upregulation of certain.
So nitric oxide is part of the reducing hypoxic injury. So part of the reason why people take, for instance, nitroglycerin pills is because it's to help with the production of nitric oxide in the case of some sort of
heart attack.
Right, some sort of ischemic event, I think is what it's called. I never can pronounce those things properly. So when there is a lack of blood flow or any way when it comes to like oxygenation of the tissues, it's also plays the role of a emergency oxygenation of the cells. So it is about an
emergency oxygenation of your penis, because that's how we get erections.
Yeah, there's also that.
So interesting. Stop here. I think I want to read.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Introduction. Penile erection and yawning are two different behavioral patterns that often occur concomitantly in different experimental conditions. Because actually yawning is you yawn when you're relaxed. And a lot of times you get boners when you're relaxed, which is why I love boners is a thing that happens sometimes.
But do you love yawning?
Actually, kind of, yeah. It's kind of pleasant.
Kind of sexy.
Yeah. Well, kind of pleasurable to do, While the importance of penile erection in reproduction does not need to be stressed, it is pertinent to recall, this is a French paper, by the way. They know they don't need to stress the importance of erections. It is pertinent to recall that yawning alone, or associated with stretching, is considered an ancestral vestige surviving through evolution that subserves the purpose of arousal. What? Subserves? What's that word mean?
I have no idea.
Okay. Dopamine receptor agonist, for example, apomorphine, and oxytocin are among the most studied substances that induce both penile erection and yawning. Both compounds induce these behavioral responses by acting in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, PVN, apparently by activating central oxytocinergic transmission. Accordingly, these dopamine and oxytocin-induced responses are prevented by electrolytic lesions to the PVN, which deplete central oxytocin, and by oxytocin reception antagonists given into the arterial ventricles. Recently, we found that induction of penile erection and yawning by dopamine receptor agonist and oxytocin depends on a normal activity of nitric oxide synthase in the PVN, because the inhibition of this enzyme in the nucleus but not in the brain areas, prevents these behavioral responses induced either by dopamine or oxytocin. So they can cause an erection and yawning by either oxytocin or dopamine. However, if there are lesions in the PVN, which produces nitric oxide, that whole system's fucked because it requires nitric oxide to make this work.
Interesting.
Is what it seems like. Interestingly, the PVN is one of the richest brain areas containing nitric oxide synthase, which among others has been identified also in the cell bodies of oxytocinergic neurons. So oxytocin and nitric oxide seem to have a stronger relationship than we may have realized.
Yeah, and it's oxytocin, kappa opioid,
Nitric oxide
cycle.
cycle.
Yes, there.
Yeah.
And this kind of goes back to some of the, like, I have been kind of expressing a negative feeling towards the towards kappa opioids overall, which of course that's always a bad idea to say one thing is particularly negative and you want to get rid of it. What you want is cycles, and there are particular effects to when it
you want to have a good amount of it. You don't want to have an overage. That's what.
Well, you
bad.
don't want to have an underage or overage of anything. Any one of
Yeah.
these systems that is important to be in balance, but balance requires cycling, and so that's
True.
one of the things is that
That's a good point.
it gets locked in a place. In other words, like you end up all of these brains that are fear modulated, like people with PTSD and things like that. It's because they've been locked in a certain place, and the brain is supposed to be cycling. In other words, there's supposed to be constant changes to these receptor densities, and it can just get stuck in a certain place. So basically, the method of fixing systems is not to set it to one place. Well, it's not to try to push it into one particular place, but it is to get something that is a cycling machine to get back into the cycling and to not get stuck in one place in the cycle. Think of it like an engine, and because that's how all of these various chemicals work, is like an engine, and there are cycles. And so what can happen is when one part of an engine locks in place, well, the whole engine starts to bind and destroy itself. And so the same thing kind of is true of all these various chemical systems, is that you have to have these cycles going up and down and up and down, and some of them have different frequencies in their cycling, and that's where we don't have enough research to understand the
cycles,
interaction of those cycles and so in other words the hierarchies of the cycles, the interactions. Well, it's not, unfortunately, they're always tangled hierarchies, and that one leads to the other, which leads back to the first.
Hey, Daniel.
Well, it is. It's there's all of these things are feedback loops. So there is this issue of what I end up finding that I get focused upon is that you get stuck into this higher kappa opioid receptor sort of place. That's a very common thing with humans who end up going through more fear. People, as they get older, they end up having more and more of this fear brain, and basically getting that back into the cycle again. And it's not about completely getting rid of your kappa opioid receptors. Of course not. It is simply making sure that those kappa opioid receptors are downregulated for a period, so that it can continue to going back into a cycle in which they'll be going up and down and trying to find. That's how homeostasis works, is a cycle between two opposing forces, and it ends up with a wave. You end up a wave going back and forth trying to find the best medium around an area. So that is the way in which those cycles work to adapt to circumstances through a homeostasis cycle.
That's the biggest thing. Homeostasis cycle.
Right. So then that gets
Can
into
we
allostasis.
please get that in science, please?
Please.
Like, can we just, speaking of long-term thinking, like, can we just...
In biology specifically.
Yeah, specifically biology. Yeah, can we... Because that's one place where we could just learn so much if we just expanded our view from one moment to the next.
It is in biology, and it is, these things are there. It's just there's disconnection between specialties. There's way too many specialists and not enough people who are weaving together the specialties and making sure that they connect with each other and use lessons learned. Because you end up with 1,000 people doing basically the same study from a different perspective. Like all throughout, when you start going through the studies all throughout medical literature. You have these things where they're repeating the same studies from a different perspective, and because they're getting so much into the details, they can't see the forest for the trees. They don't see how they're repeating the same thing and coming to the same conclusion. And it's all part of this one system that they've all together, when they look at it together, they've all proved the same things, and not one of them understands that they've all together proved some of these fascinating things, and that they've all proved them repeatedly, and they don't even see it. And instead, what you have is the pharmaceutical companies, which all that they do is just throw shit at a wall, because all they want, they are seeking reward, and seeking reward only. The reward is the moment they can put out a drug that will do anything at all. They don't give a fuck what it is, so long as it changes some sort of topical thing, so long as it changes your symptoms in some way. The moment that they can do that, regardless of the side effects, regardless of the downstream effects, regardless of the impact of the larger system, regardless of all of those things, they can profit. And so they seek the profit, and only the profit, and that's what and that's why we've got the situation that we do today. They're only going to reward, they're only going to pay research. They're not going to pay research that integrates and that puts together a better idea of the way that things work. Getting grants and things like that, it's already difficult enough for any kind of academic institution without having a very, 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 very specific thing that you're doing. And when you get into the very, very, very specific, you're not able to put together these large scale integrated systems that are across various fields. So a lot of this stuff is, there has been more focus on that in recent years, but it's just not nearly what's necessary to overcome a lot of the problems that we've created by our intrinsic focus upon these tunnels, this tunnel vision, these disconnected piles of information that are not integrated properly.
But you take one person in an afternoon and 2 hours of Googling, and they can bring together, all these different disciplines, or at least sub-disciplines. Why can't they do that? Like, why is that not a new department of, like, connect shit? Find things around this topic that it seems really simple.
Who's going to pay for that?
Yeah.
Goddamn socialists, fuck them.
People who love and are interested in the continued work of the system, regardless of the personal cost in the moment, because it's the long-term survival of the whole and the betterment of the whole that matters. Those people, those socialists, yes, I hope. We need more of them. More information. We have oxytocin, specifically kappa, and mu-opioid agonists potentially inhibit the firing of oxytocin in rats when strongly stimulated, which is where people, when they're disconnected from society and their loved ones, they can sometimes fill that hole sorta with pain pills. And I listened to a few interviews from Skid Row recently. There's a YouTube channel, I don't quite remember the name. And one of the women she's addicted to heroin, and the way she described it nearly made me cry. And mostly, a lot of that also has to do with my biological father also was addicted to heroin, and he died because of it, and her father died because of heroin, and then she went after heroin as well. So that could have been me in a much worse life. It couldn't have been with the way my mother and my family was, but, Yeah. Point is, it was one of the alternate paths that I could have gone down on, and that a lot of people do. And I also know how ostracized my dad was by the women in the family that remained, and so there was a acute lack of appreciation and just a lot of lack of love that I felt was directed towards him, and I always felt it was unfair. That was my first red pill moment, actually. And so she was describing that what is it like to take heroin? It is like being wrapped into your favorite robe blanket, going down a slide into a hot tub, landing with a cup of hot chocolate in your robe in the bathtub with hot chocolate. So just the utmost feeling of love. And you feel okay, you feel loved, you feel warm. everything that oxytocin is supposed to do and
Right.
does. And so it just really hurts my soul.
That they're replacing one with the
That they're
other
replacing
because they
one with
can't
the other.
because of the lack of love in our society, and it's self-destructing because of the lack of love in our society. Yes.
Yep. So yeah, so that's why people would go after opioids.
But it makes for a great boost to the economy for everybody to have no love.
The GDP is soaring, man. And yeah, just more evidence about the ways in which one blocks the other, and if oxytocin and opioids affect each other. And so will and the nucleus accumbens being involved, the reward pathway, of course, which is where opioid addiction, pain pill, just addiction period comes from. So we have this relationship between oxytocin, opioids, all three of them, including the addictive ones, and dopamine, because that's also addiction, and just that whole system of reward, oxytocin, and pain. Love, pain, and reward is a thing that exists. And we'll have lots of studies for you to peruse, and essentially it's like Jimmy pointed out, as an investigator, unless you have somebody who has signed a confession, the next best thing you could do as an investigator is build a case. And how do you build a case other than by presenting evidence after evidence after evidence that may not be enough to convict a person by itself, but the amount of it that you gather and the picture that it paints when it's organized together is...
It really is. It's the organization. It's like
Yeah.
a pile of parts does not an engine make. It is the way in which those parts fit together that causes the engine to actually be functional in doing something more than a pile of parts can do. So it's you can have absolutely every part to an engine and not have an engine, and that's the thing that allows us to be able to recognize things that are true when we're putting together. So there is, I do believe in pauperism, the falsification method. However, without the ability to put together information in a way that is self-reinforcing, we would not develop any science. You cannot develop something new by only taking away. You have to have something added. So yes, these things, there's always a necessity of proving things out and testing them out and taking those theories and testing them over and over. But when you have overwhelming sets of information that all point to the same thing from 1,000 different directions, it becomes extremely difficult to ignore. And there are many things that are available to us in the information that we have that people are just simply not putting it together. They're not attempting to look at the way in which, if you assemble the information in this particular way, it becomes an engine that explains and predicts all of these other things, and where they all make cohesive sense. And you can always, using that system, you can end up predicting every one of these new things that you find in 1,000 different studies.
Yeah, and something Tangled mentioned in chat about being in a funk, then to deal with that by relaxing, self-pampering, sort of having the love, self-care aspect, but then also doing something scary like a roller coaster, hiking heights, scary movie, gun range, something like that.
Heat therapy is one that can help when it's hard to, when somebody is, like, for instance, you've got people who are disabled, who've been, had lost legs in war, and that there's certain things that are difficult for them to do. That's one of the reasons why heat therapy, I like to continually recommend it, because it is one of the ways that you can get to that next level.
It's the most accessible thing,
and
in the Western world anyway.
Yeah. And that's exactly, being able to do heat therapy and breakthrough. You have to do that breakthrough heat therapy that sometimes you actually need somebody else there to make sure that you're not going to pass out. And,
oh yeah,
right, things like that.
That's why I'm glad Charles has for the times that you're sometimes napping during the bath show, and I take up the heat. I'm like, all right, guys, you might need to tell Daddy if I pass out. It's never happened before, but I definitely just once, which is shameful. I shouldn't be hitting that every time, but just once I kind of went into that point that I would get to in a hot tub where I'm like, I gotta like lean halfway out of the tub. I'm like, this is now that's the point that you got to get to, and I don't get to.
And
nearly
and
as
it is
often.
about training and pushing your limits, and because a lot of times, because it is best to be able to do breakthrough exercise. Also, that's one of the ways in which to get that kappa opioid response that is natural, that will kick the system back into its where it's supposed to be. And that's one of the reasons why you find that people who exercise, do strong, powerful exercise, difficult exercise,
They're happy motherfuckers, man.
Yeah, well, in general, they're not just
Well,
that. They're
they're
far
motivated.
healthier. How's it that they're far healthier? Because of the way all these systems are interlocked.
But also mentally, they're healthier and they're more motivated. They're more what is the word?
They find
ambitious,
life more rewarding.
but not ambitious, but not in a bad way.
Right.
Also, my personal trick as a noodle armed somebody who has proficiency for athletics but doesn't take advantage of it nearly as much as she should. My personal favorite, not favorite, the thing that I end up defaulting to is wearing warm clothing that induces heat while trying to find cave paintings and stupid Far Cry Primal and falling off of cliffs and the fucking anxiety that you just and my body's heating up. I'm feeling that kappa opioid and I'm just pushing through anyway. That's how I do that on a weekly basis. I use video games and frustration in it as something to push through, and it helps when because I feel my body heating up too, and I do like to wear warm clothes to sort of induce the heat.
But the point is that you do have to get where it's not just chronic but breakthrough, and you do have to get where there is a level of extremity, and trying to figure out where that level of extremity reaches the breakthrough point is which is it's basically it's just like the how a neuron fires, is that you get to a certain point, then once you reach that threshold, then a bunch of shit starts happening downstream. That's what happens with a neuron, and it's also what happens with a variety of these systems that are at a different scale. There is a breakthrough point at which you reach a threshold, and then breaching the threshold is crucial, because it's only once you breach the threshold that it is that the downstream effects start really occurring. So that is one of the things that you have to train up a little bit with the heat therapy. You have to train up with exercise. You have to train up with facing your fears, and some of the interim steps, when you don't actually get there, can be negative. They don't even have the positive effect until you can get to the point that you can go to the breakthrough point regularly. And so I like that Tangle was bringing up the fact that you need to be able to find relaxation, find satisfaction in your life, find comfort, and that's one of the reasons why
finding comfort is important.
The whole home business model and things like that. Sometimes that's kind of a shitty model, because you don't have a point at which you're completely relaxing and paying and just.
You gotta have your work clothes. You gotta have your home clothes.
Right. Yeah. You gotta have your you gotta have your work time and your leisure time. If you're doing just one or the other, it's going to fuck you up.
You're half-assing both. In the end of the day.
Right. It's not only that, it's just going to destroy various systems that are required for you to be happy.
Yeah, you're too burnt out to work properly, and then you feel guilty about how little work you've done, so you can't relax properly, and this is just all shit. But also, and why I bring up what Dingle mentioned in chat is as a little life hack for you fellas and ladies out there. Take your first date to a roller coaster.
Yep.
Because harmless, excitatory events.
Induction of fear.
There is it says we're mentioning acute activation of kappa opioids, and how it actually downstream leads to upregulation of oxytocin.
Oh, the other thing I was thinking is that you could use is hot foods. I think that extremely hot foods.
Spicy.
And I think that's one of the ways in which I've noticed scary movies are kind of a favorite thing of girls a lot of times too. That seems to be. I know some guys like the scary movies, but it seems like girls in general tend to like scary movies more than guys do. But I mean, that's just my own personal. I have no data to back that up. That's just a feeling I've gotten from.
I know too many people who like horror movies for me to just be like, "What are y'all doing?" Which is why.
But I think part of it is because people pick up systems that they're not exactly sure why it makes them happy, and so part of it I think is whenever you can.
If you don't have any other method by which you go after to face your fears, a scary movie would be the next best thing. Good point. That is an
And,
American.
eventually, it
It's
can
an
make-
American's cop out. I can give you that. As a Russian, I played with fiberglass and metal as my dolls. As a child, we played with broken bottles. Those are our
toys.
that was my chew toy in a crib. It's a broken glass bottle. So, I can forgive the weak Americans.
Yes. You must forgive us. Our weak, pathetic fools.
Yes. But yeah, I do enjoy heat therapy as a cheap little thing, and it's just something that goes back to my childhood as well. Because whenever I was sick, the thing you do when you have a fever is you go under like 4 blankets and sweat it out, and just actually like hike up your fever artificially so that it helps the body deal with it. And obviously not a huge fever, but like 38, 39 degrees, your average flu.
Oh yeah, and there's not just that. There's I mean, even though that was probably captured superstitiously, it's real information. Like the heat shock proteins have been shown to modulate viral growth in a variety of things. So there's
that's the remedy, the home remedy.
You can literally end up killing virus. I mean, that's part of the reason why your body heats up.
Heats up in the first place,
right?
Yeah.
And so you're actually kind of
helping it
in that direction.
So essentially, I was set up to understand a lot of things because the way natural remedies, the way Asian medicine, etc., works is sometimes, well, I don't want to say Chinese medicine, that's why I'm saying Asian medicine, because we're not going to talk about like tiger claws giving you erections, but I mean like actual true natural medicine from the East, including Russia, where you add to the body trying to do the thing. You help it.
Yeah, if it's going in that direction, make it go that direction further.
Right, exactly.
And
so,
then and that's basically one of the things we're finding. Like with allergies, you take small amounts of the allergen, and then eventually you can get rid of your allergy by slowly increasing the dose of what it is you're allergic to, and it's usually doing. We end up shying away from the things that a lot of times are what are necessary to get it over the hump, to get past that threshold. And so there's a threshold event that you're trying to push for.
And so to me, I kind of default to seeing it as a positive thing, where I'm like, I try to wear the shirt and stuff at night so that I don't stink up the bed, but like heating up at night under blankets, or like wearing hoodies to work out, or just in general adding layers and bearing through the discomfort of the heat is something that I enjoy and find perverse pleasure in. And I've also known people who deal with anxiety and severe just their brain attacking them on a daily basis, and experiencing like intestinal pain, for instance. And so the way this model deals with it is she finds odd enjoyment in pain that she can control, such as layer exercises. So she throws herself into physical exercise and thereby choosing a type of pain, and so that's something.
Choose your pain, or your pain chooses you.
Yeah. And so and that's generally something that I see people who are self-made or just in general try to crawl out of the hole that life made for them. They find ways to seek out pain in a controlled, or seek out difficulty in a controlled way, and to follow a path that is not easy, but to even specifically seek out discomfort, but the kind that builds you. And so to not shy away from
there is difficulty that breaks down. There is especially when it is chronic. It's there a lot of times people are like, oh well, difficult things are good for you, so just sit there and fucking suffer. No,
or if
that's not right.
Exposure therapy to shellfish will lead to anaphylaxis. Like don't do exposure therapy to a point where it won't start out small, right?
Small
don't go
amounts.
all out. Expose yourself to all of it at once.
Right.
Yeah. There definitely are
the dose,
caveats.
The dose makes the poison. I mean, you can't just it's like, oh well, if I just jump off a building, I'll
get rid of my fear.
I'll get exposed to the to falling damage, and
that's how Skyrim works. The more you do a thing, The more you train up that ability.
Yes, there are simplistic, there are oversimplifications you can take to anything and make it stupid. That is
There are exceptions
absolutely
to
true.
rules, but
Yes.
But that is one thing that should be an assumption about us that people may not realize or are aware of because they haven't been around for too long.
It's something I've had to explain 1,000 times.
Yeah,
there's exceptions and then there's the rule.
So we generally highlight the rule while being perfectly aware of the exception and do point out exceptions when it warrants it. But a lot of times that should be the assumption. We know there are exceptions and we're just still talking about the rule though because it's still a rule.
But there's certain times it's like, okay, there are times when the exception invalidates the rule, and there's times that the rule makes the exception irrelevant. Mm-hmm. But the fact that there is a general rule that you can go by does not mean that there are not very important exceptions, and the fact that there are exceptions do not mean that the rule is valueless. Mm-hmm. So there is always this thing that seems to be a constant problem with people where they try to do one or the other mm-hmm. without consideration of the interaction of exceptions and rules. And there are times when the rule becomes the exception mm-hmm. and the exception becomes the rule.
Like your favorite example of a siege in a fort on a hill. Best place to hold out an army or kind of the peasants rebelling. You're in a stone castle, nobody's going to touch you. But if they're holding a siege for days and days and days and weeks, and you run out of food,
then that becomes your prison, and it kills you.
And so you can't escape because you're on a hill. Everyone will see you leave.
What was safety becomes danger, and what was dangerous, leaving and trying to escape, becomes the safety. Yep. Had you made the decision at the right time with the right information,
exactly.
But sometimes you cannot get that information.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so. Hindsight, but at the same time, but that's the benefit of hindsight is we apply that for the future situation and be like, is this the time to flip safety versus
obviously there was in general people built castles because as a rule most of the time that you didn't have armies large enough to overtake you in your nice little castle, and that's why it was useful. But then there are exceptions when the army is large enough, and you staying in that castle is going to be your doom. And so it's just knowing that those exceptions come along and mm-hmm. completely invalidate the rule in that particular context is something that I don't know. It's just difficulty. There's a lot of difficulty in dealing with people's view of that subject matter for some reason.
Well, because I think it comes down to love and fear.
Yeah,
because they are so bought into an idea that so interested in that safety.
Well, I think it comes down to a person's dopamine, their reward system and things like whether or not they're a gambler. Because one of the things I've pointed out before is a gambler is a mindset that is...
for the record, that's my mindset.
Right. It's an optimist. It's a person who is...
does not expect bad things to happen ever.
Right. And but also a lot of times it becomes somebody who is obsessed with exceptions and focuses on them as more important.
Becomes schizotypal.
And the truth of the matter is when there is when you've got a lot of people all using the rule, then for instance, that's what innovation is. It's an exception. A creation of something new is a creation of an exception. It's seeking out exceptions where all the things that have already been done are being done, and so therefore they become less valuable. So therefore there are certain niches that have to be looked for, and so therefore seeking out an exception is extremely important. However, there are times when there is plenty of resource, and following the rules by far the better strategy. And so there are different times and contexts where strategy the ruling strategy is to focus on the exception, and in other times it is to focus upon the rule. And so of course we have mindsets that do both or are sometimes very much towards one or the other. And just being able to deal with that exception, focus on the rules or focus on the exceptions. A lot of times that ends up being kind of split along the conservative liberal line as well, where a lot of times liberal perspectives are more focused upon the exception, mm-hmm. whereas conservative ideas are more focused upon the rule.
I feel like they also take an exception and act like it's a rule, though.
Yeah,
But that's the
but
horseshoe of
everybody
both
does that,
sides.
right? Everybody does that,
Both
so-
do that. You're right.
Right. Yeah. So it's like there's
But what we're
it's a very general.
what you're talking about, though, I think even better to be said is that there's more certainty in conservatives and more doubt in liberals,
Yes. Exactly.
just in general about everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hence the preference for exception versus rule.
Right,
Yeah.
and keep in mind,
That's-
I strongly believe that a person should be constantly going back and forth over
Between
a
liberal and
middle line
conservative.
of a liberal and conservative.
Yep.
And it's only the extremes when disconnected from each other in alchemical divorce, where they are
Mm-hmm.
no longer in contact with the other side, where they hate
Where it's
everything
no longer a spectrum.
that is the other side, and are not willing to learn from the other way of being. That becomes completely dysfunctional,
That's the
and
dysfunction.
destructive.
Yeah.
And both of them are that way. Both of them, both extremes of both liberal and conservative, are complete destroyers in their own way.
When you believe you have nothing to learn and you have nowhere to grow, you are death incarnate.
Yeah. When you're green, you're grown. When you're ripe, you're rotten.
Yep.
That's another way of saying
Any ideology or any group that believes that they can't learn anything or they can never grow, that they have everything perfect, is just no friend of mine.
that. And those people who never believe that there's anything that's better than anything else are no friend of mine, which is the opposite of what you were saying.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've actually kind of covered the
that's
whole
perfect.
love and fear, and connection between the sides, and the importance of
And
both
pretty
of them,
much-
the cycle between them, and
exactly
how
a
they
2-hour
fit to
mark.
all of the various.
2 hours and 6 minutes.
Cool.
Heck yes. Fucking nailing it. So, we shall take all this juicy discussion into the after chat with our patrons.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. And we will answer the question, do we mean that a government in general is so far right compared to the rest of the world they can't break free from their beliefs in their correctness? I don't know. Become a patron to find out what we have to say about that. Yeah, cool. So we shall see you all week after next, or next week, depending on how things go. Ideally, we would like to do every week CherrySTEM, but we can promise about twice a month as it stands, which, you know, is good. It's good. But we'll try to come at you every week. Maybe intersperse some interesting news seed. I certainly have something I've been wanting to talk about with genetic memory. Even though it is kind of a news seed thing, I would kind of like to make it its own show.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe week after next,
Maybe we should do
could
something that's a
whole-
little more speculative types of things, and like
every
a
other
little more
conspiracy, every other conspiracy
yeah,
theory.
conspiracy theory, or like something that's interesting that is conceptual,
Kabbalah?
like is noosphere theory, and we I still dealing with that kind of thing.
I want to talk about Kabbalah too and all this other fun stuff.
Yeah, Kabbalah.
Yeah,
Sure.
all sorts of noosphere. things.
Kabbalah, Rosicrucians.
Yeah.
Those.
Ancient secret. That's the whole point. I wanted master notes, because that was my goal, is to have every other week CherrySTEM and every other week master notes, where you share with me and also the audience, but mostly with me, the things that you talk about in your groups.
Oh,
The foundations of consciousness
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we can have a hard science show one week, and then a soft or meta science show another week.
Yeah.
That would make me
Well,
happy.
I mean, some stuff though. I mean, heck, why not? Do kind of sci-fi and just
That too, yeah.
getting very. It's fun to get into to extremely highly speculative, and then tie it back to how is this. Both
And to be
speculative
fair,
yeah.
the goal is to turn this into a podcast, and nobody's going to listen to anything we've done up to this point. People will only listen to the speculative, fun, interesting stuff. So we absolutely have to start going into that direction, because the goal is to maintain CherrySTEM on YouTube as it is, but to be able to upload new episodes and turn it into a podcast starting with season 4. So I want...
Okay, so starting with season 4, we'll get heavily into the entirety of the neoclassical physics and how that explains spirituality from a neuroscience perspective using Bum and Pribram and all that stuff. We'll do the whole thing.
So what do you think? Once a
start
month?
from the very beginning.
Or twice a month? Or every
Fuck,
week?
I don't know.
Because we can make them small and be every week. Or we can make them giant and be once a month.
Who knows?
But I kind of like having a series, so to, you know, an ongoing weekly, especially if it's a podcast, I really like to give people a little dopamine drip as often as I can. So we have goals and plans, and you guys can help us out with our goals and plans by supporting us on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/AnnaCherry. If you can support us without hardship, we'd highly appreciate it. You also get lots of goodies as a reward for your support. But, you know, that's not why you're doing it, right? You're doing it just to make good things be more of in the world of things. That. Surely.
To increase eloquence,
okay.
eloquentialness.
The next milestone, I will take eloquence lessons.
Loquacious. Right.
Loquacious? I will pay for loquacious lessons. With your help.
And we'll be the smartness you ever smarted.
Yes. So help us out. Help give Cherry voice and speech lessons.
Me too. Every once in a while.
Thank you everyone for watching, and we will see you next week.